Okay, so here we have our next lecture in BIOL3465, Tropical Forest Ecology and Use. And this one is on basic silvicultural terms and practices. So in this one, we're going to take a look at how foresters will organize a forest for management and in particular for timber extraction. So we'll take a look at some of the basic characteristics of a forest which a forester must take into account when they are managing that forest, and how they will organize that forest to achieve their objectives. So we're going to take a look at, first of all, what is silviculture. For those of you who don't know what silviculture is, we'll go into the definitions of silviculture and so on. We'll talk about the goals and objectives of silviculture, what foresters try to do when they use silvicultural techniques to manipulate a forest. We'll take a look at the spatial organization of silviculture, how silvicultural techniques and operations are organized within a forest spatially, and finally we'll take a look at the different components of a silvicultural system, or the different practices or techniques involved in a silvicultural system. So first of all, what is silviculture? Well, as we saw in the previous lecture, forest management is the manipulation of forests to produce natural resources but still allow the natural resources to renew. So this is the underlying or fundamental tenet of using renewable natural resources. You must try and extract the resource but don't damage the resource so it cannot produce any more. Well, what silviculture is the art and science of managing tree communities in forests to produce those resources. So silviculture, the word itself, is similar to agriculture, but the silvi part is pretty much Latin for trees. So silviculture is basically tree farming, or changing the forest to achieve human goals. And put down there that it is the art and the science of managing tree communities. Quite often it's based on science, so a lot of the techniques and so on are based around tested methodologies and so on. But unfortunately, because they deal with complex ecosystems, natural ecosystems quite often, then a lot of the interactions between the components are very vague, and because they're so complex, it's difficult to predict what is going to happen when you change one component or harvest one component and so on. So quite often silviculture is an art as well, particularly so in a place like a tropical forest where the species are pretty much understudied, so nobody knows their exact responses to different management techniques and different changes in their environment and harvesting and so on. So quite often a forester is left to rely on the experience that he has in other similar ecosystems with other similar species. But because in tropical ecosystems the species are often so different, then the forester is forced to rely pretty much on their own intuition as to what to do in a particular situation to carry out and to achieve their objectives. So quite often silviculture is the art and science of managing tree communities in forests to produce resources, and those resources may be timber, and it usually is timber because that's the most economic resource at the moment, but it can also mean other things like rubber, spices. It could mean wild meat in that forest. So changing that forest to produce a resource is the main goal of silviculture. Silviculture. So silviculture, like agriculture, is rooted in the ecological and biological sciences, but it is very strongly influenced by economics and administration. So what that means is that ecology and biology determine what silvicultural systems can potentially be employed at a site, and economics and administrative aims determines which of those should be chosen. So if you have a site, say in central Trinidad, you cannot go and plant oak trees on that site. Oak trees are a native of temperate environments, so they drop their leaves every year. During the winter they need cold weather to get rid of pests and diseases, and they simply won't grow in Trinidad. So even though a hardwood, oak hardwood, is a very valuable commodity, ecology and biology means that you simply cannot grow oak trees in Trinidad. So instead you would have to grow teak, Caribbean pine, or maybe crapo, maybe sip, or some of the trees which are adapted to tropical conditions and which can grow in Trinidad. Now, how you would choose between those different types of trees would depend on your economic and administrative aims, and that will decide you on which tree to particularly grow. And that's if you're looking to establish a plantation. If your administrative aims and goals mean that you want to establish a natural forest with a combination of different species in a more or less natural ecosystem, then you would choose your species accordingly, which ecology and biology will allow you to plant at that particular site. So silviculture uses ecology and biology to determine what is possible at a site, and then uses economics and administrative aims and objectives to decide which of those possible alternatives should be used at a particular site. So how do we determine those aims and objectives of silviculture? Well, it's all down to the aims and objectives of the landowner. So what the landowner wants out of the property which is in question is the key to what sort of aims and objectives are to be used or to go for. So the silvicultural techniques then would be dictated by those aims and objectives. Alright, so when it comes to, and there's a big dichotomy here when it comes to landowners. Landowners can either be private landowners or they can be public or government landowners. And in tropical forests, the vast majority of tropical forests tend to be public or government owned, but there are still a few, and there are still forests which are owned by private landowners around. Generally, a private landowner is much more concerned with some sort of return. So economics takes the big priority when it comes to privately owned forests. So generally the forest is run to make money. This is alternatively in a public forest or a government-owned forest. Quite often economics is not the main important point or function of a government-owned forest. So it's not so much making money out of the government forest, instead providing services or even goods to as many people as possible. So government-owned forests generally tend to have very different aims and objectives to privately owned forests. So the different aims and objectives are going to influence the different silvicultural techniques employed. If the goal of the landowner is to maximize profit, to maximize the economic return, then the forest will be manipulated to try and maximize economic return. And the economic return which is generated needs to go back and pay for all the inputs which need to be put into that land to create those goods and services. Landowners usually have to pay some ownership costs, whether they be land taxes, whether they be payments on interest rates, on money which was borrowed from the bank to buy the land in the first place. So all of these things are ownership costs. So the project or the silvicultural operation which is carried out in the forest needs to pay for itself, needs to pay for the project, with enough left over to pay the cost of the ownership of the land. And finally, there needs to also be enough left over, if it is a private landowner, for there to be a profit which will make it worthwhile for that landowner to use their time to manage this particular forest. Because remember, a landowner could be off somewhere else, maybe in a job in Petrotrin and earning a certain amount of money from Petrotrin. But if they have to give up that Petrotrin job to go and work on their land, then they need to be sure that they're going to get enough money to cover that lost earnings that they give up from not working at Petrotrin anymore. In terms of government forests, on the other hand, economics is not the main point, and instead a government forest or management of a government forest, usually by a government agency like a forestry division and so on, is more concerned with making or using silvicultural techniques to make sure that the maximum number of stakeholders in society are satisfied, so that if there are timber producers who need to be satisfied, they need to get their timber, but not to modify or damage the forest to such an extent such as the hunters who also use the forest are disadvantaged, or the ecotourism operators who also use the forest are disadvantaged, and so on. And silvicultural techniques must be used then to make sure that all of those groups are happy with their forest. So silvicultural techniques can be used to improve a forest for both timber or other market commodities or non-market commodities. So we can use different types of silvicultural techniques. For instance, if we are using, if our main objective for our forest is to produce as much money as possible, we will quite often clear fell that forest and just plant the species which are economically important to us, and therefore we maximize the amount of economically important timber and minimize all the timber which is not economically important. So our silvicultural techniques therefore will be things like clear cutting and artificial regeneration, or planting of our own seedlings. On the other hand, if we're in a government controlled forest and we want to preserve the natural ecosystem so that hunters and ecotourism operators as well as timber producers can all benefit from that forest, then we will probably use a silvicultural technique such as selective logging, where we would go into the forest and only take out 1 or 2 trees per hectare and generally retain the character and the biodiversity of the forest as much as possible. Okay, so silvicultural techniques therefore are very much determined by the objectives of the owners of that forest. And multiple goals can be achieved from the same land, but usually to the detriment of pursuing one goal alone. So in other words, if your goal is to satisfy as many people as possible, then your timber producers are not going to get as much money from that forest as they would if the forest was converted to a plantation. Okay, so if you have more than one goal for the forest, quite often that means that you don't achieve the maximum for any one of those one goals. Excuse me. If on the other hand you just pursue one goal for that forest, then you can completely reorient or change or manage that forest so that it provides the maximum amount of return for that particular goal, and that goal is maximized. So because of this, say a timber producer may want to have more timber out of a forest than a conservationist cares to allow because it's to the detriment of a particular species of animal, for instance. Conflicts often arise in government-owned forests which have more than one stakeholder, and we've seen some monumental conflicts in the past, particularly up in the Pacific Northwest. If you do a Google search on the spotted owl in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, there was a big conflict there between timber producers who wanted to log old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest, which were the only habitat for an endangered species called the spotted owl. So there was a big conflict there between timber producers and conservationists. In Trinidad today, would there be a similar sort of conflict? Not so much. Generally, forestry tends to work fairly closely with, say, maybe the hunters associations, and conservation groups really in Trinidad aren't mature enough to demand to have a say in silvicultural management of tropical forests for a particular goal. Alright, so we can manage our forests and we can manipulate them using silvicultural techniques or tree farming techniques. It's important to understand that a forest will be organized according to certain basic principles to make it possible to utilize or focus those techniques on the forest. Usually the forest is not manipulated or treated or managed all at the same time. There simply isn't enough resources to do that. It's much more efficient to manage a small part of the forest at any one time. So quite often the forest is broken up into smaller units, and each one of those smaller units, the silvicultural management technique is carried out across that smaller unit at any one time. And this smaller unit, or the basic unit of silviculture, is known as a stand. Can be also known as a coupe, C-O-U-P-E, or a block. So the forest is broken up into these smaller basic units, and this is quite often known as a stand, and I'm going to talk about stands in this lecture. So what is a stand? It's basically an area of the forest which contains a community or a group of trees which grow together in a particular part of the forest. All those stands grouped together form the overall forest. And forests themselves quite often are themselves part of an overall landscape, which may include forested and non-forested elements or ecosystems. So in a landscape, your forest may be a corner or a quarter of the landscape, or the forest may actually be broken up into smaller forests or stands scattered in different parts of the landscape. What happens in those forests does influence what happens on the rest of the landscape, and quite often, particularly in government-owned forests, that needs to be taken into account when setting goals and objectives for the forest, and also when employing particular silvicultural techniques. So within a stand or a subunit of a forest, silvicultural treatments are applied to move vegetation communities in a direction that will achieve the goals of the landowner. So if you are a private landowner and you have your forest, it's broken up into stands, you may want to maximize your economic return, and the best way to do that is to remove all those weedy trees which are not bringing you any return, and replace all those weedy trees with a good timber tree which is going to be saleable for you. So you will want to establish a plantation. So with each stand at a time, you will go in and clear cut the forest and replant it or regenerate it with seedlings of your timber tree. And you will do that one stand after the next. Planning of land use at one scale often influences planning at other scales. This is spatial scales. So if your forest is part of a landscape and your forest is actually on the steeper slopes around the edges of a watershed, for instance, it may require that your forest not be clear-cut. So using clear-cut methods to establish a plantation may not be allowed in your forest, because if you do that, you'll expose the soil and therefore cause erosion, which will be detrimental to the rest of the landscape. So in other words, the silvicultural techniques which you can employ in your forest may be controlled by the overall use, the context in which your forest sits. If your forest, however, is on flat land and has no real influence on the surrounding landscape, then the silvicultural techniques that you may use, and therefore the objectives which you may carry out, will be less constrained. Alright, so silvicultural treatments. Let's focus in on some of these different silvicultural treatments. These can be divided into three phases: regeneration, tending, and harvest. Regeneration, as the name suggests, is the establishment of a crop using natural or artificial establishment techniques. Each involves a different cost. So, as you may imagine, using artificial establishment techniques to regenerate, in other words, producing seedlings or purchasing seedlings, which are then planted in to create the forest, is going to be much more expensive than just allowing the seedlings which normally spring up or volunteer in your forest without you having to do anything. That would be much cheaper. So if you don't have very much money, your silvicultural strategy for regeneration may be natural regeneration. If you have more money and your goal is to create a forest which will give you maximum return, then it could be that artificial establishment techniques or providing your own seedlings is much more within the scope of your silvicultural system. Tending involves ensuring the maximum growth of your target species, so a minimal time passes before a yield is realized or a harvest is possible. So tending involves maximum growth of the target species. So if you have a plantation, you may need to go in during the growth of that plantation to do things such as pruning or thinning or weeding. So a silvicultural treatment like weeding would be going in and cutting out all the shrubs and R-selected species which would be competing with your timber trees. You may also need to cut out some K-selected trees which are not good timber species. But you may also need to cut out some of your timber trees, and that is known as thinning. Quite often when you regenerate your forest through seedlings and so on, you will tend to plant a lot more seedlings than you necessarily want or will allow to grow to full size. This is either to try and get some sort of return at the thinning stage, but also to promote competition between these smaller seedlings so that they will tend to grow tall and straight rather than spread out and branch lower down. But at some point those seedlings are going to start competing with one another too much and slow down their individual growth rates. So you will need to take out every second seedling to provide space and resources for the remaining seedlings to grow at a maximum rate. So thinning is an important silvicultural tending practice. Pruning also allows you to remove lower branches on your individual seedlings and therefore promote the growth of a tall, straight tree, which would be ideal for timber production. Harvest methods are also very much influence or different types of silvicultural systems. I've also already spoken about clear cutting and selection cutting and how the different harvest methods like clear cutting and selection cutting would be controlled by the objectives of your silvicultural system and also constraints placed on your management of your forest by the context in which your forest is. So these different techniques are very much dependent on whether the forest is one of two main types, whether your forest is an even-aged forest or an uneven-aged forest. Now an even-aged forest is pretty much those plantations that I told you about. But an even-aged forest does have a natural equivalent, a natural even-aged forest, which tends to be found in more unpredictable type environments. An even-aged forest is usually a forest which is naturally destroyed by some catastrophic event like a fire or a hurricane on a regular basis. So an even-aged forest is a forest which regenerates all at the same time after this natural disaster. And it's quite often the same species or a similar species which regenerates at that time. So all the seedlings of these same species germinate and grow up and start growing at the same time. So an even-aged forest is a forest which has all the trees in a stand of the same age and approximately the same size. So a lot of these temperate evergreen forests, these conifer forests, are even-aged forests. And you will just find a single age and a single size of trees in the stands of an even-aged forest. And as you can imagine, those sorts of forests are quite good for maximizing timber production. So another type of forest would be the eucalypt forest, or some of the Caribbean pine forests. And these types of species very much lend themselves to plantation types of forests. So quite often we can think of plantation forests as even-aged forests, but instead of the natural regeneration, instead we would have a artificial regeneration in the case of a plantation. An uneven-age forest, on the other hand, consists of stands where the trees are spread over at least 3 size classes. So within one stand you will have trees which are seedlings, trees which are saplings, and trees which are mature full-size canopy trees. So an uneven-age forest, instead of just having a single size of tree in that one stand, instead you have a whole range of sizes, a J-type distribution of size in your uneven-aged forest. So seedlings and regeneration occur alongside mature trees in an uneven-aged forest, but in an uneven-aged forest. In an even-aged forest, on the other hand, seedlings will only occur in a stand with other seedlings. Seedlings will not occur in a stand which has mature trees. And this has important implications for the types of silvicultural operations which you can use. In even-age forests, there are 3 phases of silviculture: the regeneration, tending and harvesting, and together they're called a rotation. In an uneven-age forest, these different phases are called a cutting cycle. An even-age forests regenerate only after the previous crop has been removed. So only when the forest has been clear-felled and all the individuals have been removed in an even-age forest can that forest be planted once again with seedlings. On the other hand, in an uneven-age forest, the forests are continuously regenerating, usually by natural means, and once you take out a mature individual, there are seedlings and saplings already there to take the place of the mature tree that you've taken out. Tending of even-age stands can involve thinning and pruning, and tending of uneven-age forests may involve weeding out of non-commercial species at harvest time. But quite often uneven-age forests are left alone for much of the cutting cycle, so that they are only visited when they are harvested. Even-age forests are harvested using clear-cut or seed tree methods. Now the seed tree method is when you go into a forest and you cut down 95% of all the trees, but you leave another 5% of the trees, of the tallest, straightest trees, and then you provoke those trees to drop seed, and you can do that by burning underneath them or something like that. So these trees will drop their seeds, and that will form the regeneration of the next crop. Alternatively, you can go in and plant seedlings after you've clear cut. In uneven-age forests, you need to harvest using selection or shelterwood methods. Excuse me. Selection harvesting is to go in and only take out 1 or 2 trees per hectare. So you don't clear cut. Now the idea of that is to maintain those shaded environment so that the timber trees, or the seedlings and the saplings of the timber trees, have a suitable environment to continue growing. If you go and clear cut, the seedlings and the saplings of your timber trees will quite often get swamped by our selected species and vines, and they wouldn't be able to grow as well, and they may even die. So different techniques are employed in these different types of forests, these even age forests and uneven age forests. Generally, we tend to find uneven age forests in tropical regions. There are actually very few even age forests naturally in the tropical regions. However, we do tend to find examples of even age forests, even in Trinidad, in the plantations which are created or formed of a particular tree species which is valuable timber. So those teak plantations can be thought of as even-aged forests. But those teak plantations are not going to be able to regenerate naturally, so they are quite often regenerated artificially if the forestry division has the money. And the intensity of the techniques, the silvicultural techniques applied, will determine the amount of inputs required and also the amount of return expected. So if you have a clear-cut method of harvesting, that will take a lot more resources than a selection cutting where a lower density of stems is taken. Because of that, if we would expect to get a bigger return from the clear cutting operation. All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. Bye.